"You're nothing to us, David, get out!" her mother snarled, eyes filled with icy contempt. I spun to Sarah, heart pounding. "Please, tell me it's a lie. Tell me you don't have another family." She opened her mouth, tears trembling on her lashes, but the damage was done. My entire world felt like it collapsed into a bottomless pit of betrayal, with no way back up. It was a Friday night like many others, at least that's how it started. My girlfriend Sarah had invited me to what she called a casual family dinner at the Miller's home. I'd done this a dozen times before. Show up, smile politely, nod along as her parents talked about their accomplishments, and endure subtle, needling comments about my life choices. But I never expected this dinner to explode into a point of no return. They cornered me in the living room, all three of them, Mr. Miller, Mrs. Miller, and Sarah's older sister Emily, like they were forming a panel. Sarah was off in the kitchen, and I could hear the clank of dishes. She wasn't there to see how her family's eyes held me hostage. Mrs. Miller came forward first, arms crossed, wearing a polite smile that never touched her eyes. "David," she began in that icy, show hostess tone she always used, "we know you've been helpful in the past, fixing things around here, but we've got bigger concerns now." "Concerns?" I echoed, my pulse already quickening. "Yes," Mr. Miller chimed in. He tugged on the cuff of his shirt, a habit he had whenever he was about to deliver some pronouncement. "Your job situation, for one. Sarah tells us your company might be restructuring. Is that right?" I nodded, swallowing hard. "They're reorganizing. I've been thinking about looking for a new position, just in case." He made a show of sighing dramatically. "It's an unstable field, software engineering. We can't have Sarah tied to uncertainty. We value security in this family." I felt my gut twist. They'd always acted like my career was some kind of flimsy side gig, despite the fact that I was doing pretty well. But I forced a smile. "Look, Mr. Miller, That's when Emily stepped in, arms folded under her elbows. "You can't just look, Mr. Miller, your way through this. Honestly, it feels like you're just extra weight sometimes, David. You're always in the way." The words felt like a slap, raw and painful. I glanced around for Sarah, desperate for her to appear and defend me, to say something in my favor, but it was just the three of them. 3 pairs of eyes pinning me to the spot. Then Mrs. Miller delivered the final blow. "We don't need you here. You're unnecessary. Always in the way." It was like a cold bucket of water drenched my entire body. I felt my shoulders tense up, my heart thud wildly. The one person I needed, Sarah, was nowhere to be found. So I did the only thing that felt right in that suffocating moment. I walked out. I left the Millers' pristine living room, their manicured lawns, their polished floors, and drove off into the night, not even sure where I was going. But I knew I was done with them. I ended up at a rundown motel on the edge of town, the kind of place with flickering neon signs and a single occupant behind the front desk who barely looks up from their crossword puzzle. I checked in, turned off my phone, and threw myself onto the creaking bed. My mind was spinning with a bizarre mix of fury and heartbreak. How could Sarah's family say such cruel things after 2 years of me trying my best to fit in? At some point, I must have drifted off. When I woke up and turned my phone on the next day, it exploded with notifications. 27 missed calls from Sarah, over a dozen texts, a few voicemails. My heart fluttered at the first glimmer of hope. Maybe she was calling to apologize on behalf of her family. Maybe she realized they'd gone too far. I pressed play on the first voicemail. "David, hey, it's me. I don't know why you left like that. My parents were just talking. Please call me back." "Just talking?" I thought, my anger flaring again. The second voicemail was more frantic. "David, please, Mom and Dad are really upset. They said you overreacted. Let's sit down and straighten everything out." The third had a sharper tone. "David, seriously, pick up the phone. This is getting ridiculous." And then the fourth voicemail changed everything. It wasn't Sarah's voice, it was Mrs. Miller's, chillingly formal. "David, we are disappointed in your behavior. However, we understand you might be under stress. We invite you to a family brunch tomorrow at 11 to make amends if you're willing to apologize for your outburst. We expect you to demonstrate that you are worthy of Sarah." Worthy? The word rang in my head like a harsh bell. I needed to prove myself. I almost threw my phone across the room, but there was one more voicemail, the fifth one, again from Sarah. "David, the sprinkler system is broken. Dad can't fix it. We need you to come back before Mom's roses die. Please, can you come fix it? After that, we'll talk." The sprinklers. Of course, they needed me to fix their expensive irrigation system, and that was the real reason for the urgent calls. Not love, not worry, just convenience. Any lingering hope I had that Sarah's silence at dinner was some misunderstanding instantly vanished. It was all about what I could do for them. I decided to pack my things and leave town for a while. I didn't know where I was going. Maybe the mountains, maybe a bigger city. I just knew I had to get away from the Millers. My heart felt bruised and my pride felt trampled. But beyond the fury, I was hurt. Sarah had let this happen. Halfway out of town, my phone buzzed again, an unknown number. Normally, I'd ignore it, but something told me to pick up. A shaky voice on the other end whispered my name. David, my name's Marianne. I'm Sarah's sister. For a second, I thought she meant Emily, but the voice was different, softer. I pulled over to the side of the road, confusion swirling in my mind. Sarah's sister? Emily? She exhaled sharply. No, I'm not Emily. I'm from her other family. My blood ran cold. What are you talking about? I don't want to do this over the phone, Marianne murmured. But if you really want answers, meet me at the Bluebird Cafe on Orchard Street in half an hour. If you don't show, I understand. The line went dead. My heart hammered in my chest. Another sister? Another family? I sat there gripping the steering wheel, debating. Could this be some elaborate prank? But curiosity gnawed at me. Maybe this was a piece of the puzzle. Maybe it would explain why Sarah's family acted like they had some dark, twisted secret. The Bluebird Cafe was a cozy, out-of-the-way place that smelled of roasted coffee beans and fresh pastries. Tucked in a corner booth, a young woman with eyes eerily like Sarah's was nursing a cup of tea. She looked up when I approached, her expression wary. Marianne? I asked. She nodded, gesturing for me to sit. Thanks for coming. I settled into the seat, searching her face for some family resemblance. She had the same gentle curve to her jaw, the same slight dimple in her right cheek, but there was a weariness to her that I'd never seen in Sarah. You said you're Sarah's sister, but not Emily. I began carefully. Marianne chewed her lip, eyes darting around as if she was afraid someone might overhear. Right, I'm from her other family, the second family. Sarah doesn't talk about us. She's not allowed. My entire body tensed. Allowed by who? Marianne traced the rim of her cup. By her parents, or I guess her first parents. I don't really know what to call them. They have some arrangement with my parents, an arrangement that goes way back. It's a debt thing. Something sank in the pit of my stomach. A debt? She nodded, her eyes flicking up to meet mine. Years ago, Mr. Miller and my dad, Mr. Samuels, were in business together. It went bad. My dad was left with huge debts thanks to some shady deals. Mr. Miller offered to help if Dad signed an agreement of sorts. Part of it involved, well, their children eventually making things right. I stared at her, my mind racing. Children, like, the families decided you kids would repay the debt? Marianne's face twisted in a grimace. Exactly. My dad tried to back out, but Mr. Miller threatened legal action. He insisted that both families had to remain connected. Emily and I were born around the same time, but Dad could never talk about me publicly because Mr. Miller forbade it. She swallowed hard. Sarah was always the golden child. She had more freedom. She got to live in the big house, but Emily and I were supposed to follow certain rules. This debt, it's like a chain around our necks. My head spun. I'd known the Millers were controlling, but this was on another level. So Sarah's known about you? Marianne nodded, tears glistening. Yeah, she hates the secret, but she can't break free. Mr. Miller controls everything. Her finances, her future. Emily plays along because she's next in line to manage the family deals. And I'm just stuck. I reached out to you because I thought you deserved to know the truth. They treat you like you're worthless, but the reason they hold so tight to Sarah is that they need her to keep up appearances for their business deals and the debt. I left that cafe in a daze, my mind a tangled mess of confusion and betrayal. Sarah had a second family, a sister named Marianne, living under some hush-hush arrangement, all because of an old debt that forced the families to remain linked. And that twisted logic of we don't need you actually meant they don't want me messing up their carefully planned facade. On one hand, I felt a surge of sympathy for Sarah. She'd been caught in something deeply messed up since birth. But on the other hand, I felt rage, because even if she was a victim of this bizarre arrangement, she'd kept me in the dark. She'd let me walk into a hornet's nest without a single warning. I tried calling Sarah, intending to confront her with what I'd learned. No answer. I sent her a text. We need to talk. I know about Marianne. Almost immediately, I saw the 3 little dots appear, then vanish, then appear again. Finally, a single text popped up. Please come to my house tomorrow 11 a.m. I'll explain everything, but don't mention Marianne to anyone else, or they'll make her life even harder. The next morning, I drove back to the Millers' neighborhood, passing the manicured lawns and identical mailboxes like I was stepping into a picture-perfect magazine spread. My stomach churned. The last time I was here, they basically shoved me out the door with their words. Now, I was coming back for answers. I arrived at exactly 11 a.m. The sprinklers were back on. Maybe they'd found some other poor sap to fix them. The front door opened, and there stood Sarah, wearing the same anxious expression I'd heard in her voicemails. She led me into the living room, where Mr. Miller, Mrs. Miller, and Emily sat, waiting like a jury. The tension was suffocating. Sarah perched on the edge of the couch, her hands trembling in her lap. "Mom, Dad, I told David there's something he needs to know." Her voice cracked. "He found out anyway." She glanced at me, and I nodded, stepping forward. "I met Marianne." It was like someone had cut the power. Every face in that room went pale. Mr. Miller's jaw clenched, and Mrs. Miller's composure cracked for just a split second, revealing raw panic beneath her icy exterior. Emily actually gasped, genuine fear in her eyes. Mr. Miller stood, tugging on his shirt cuffs aggressively. "That was not your place to discover, David. You had no right—" "No right?" I spat, anger boiling over. "I had a right to know the woman I've been with for 2 years has an entire second family she never told me about. And I sure have a right to know why you treat me like garbage when you're the ones hiding skeletons in your closet." Mrs. Miller rose, face contorting. "We had an arrangement with Mr. Samuels, and it doesn't concern you, David. It's family business." I laughed bitterly. "Don't concern me. This has everything to do with me. I've watched you belittle me, degrade my career, and brush me off like a spare tire, all while you're forcing Sarah and Emily to keep quiet about Marianne. And apparently there's some debt that ties you to her father, something that's cost the children their freedom." Sarah closed her eyes, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Mom, Dad, just tell him. Tell him why you keep saying he's in the way." Emily crossed her arms, her voice trembling with barely contained frustration. "Because if David stayed in Sarah's life, it'd complicate the plan. She's supposed to marry someone else eventually, someone who can help us settle this once and for all. We can't have you screwing it up, David." For a moment, the world stood still. They already had someone picked out for Sarah, someone who would help pay off that ancient debt. I was never part of the plan at all. I took a step back, mind reeling. My throat felt tight, chest constricted. Sarah wanted to say something, but her mother silenced her with a single steely glance. Mr. Miller's voice rumbled through the silence. "This is bigger than you, David. You need to walk away. If you truly cared about Sarah, you would let her fulfill her obligation to this family. We don't have time for uncertain men with uncertain futures. We need stability, power, resources." My heart hammered. My entire relationship with Sarah had been overshadowed by a plan I'd known nothing about, but in that moment, an odd sense of clarity washed over me. This wasn't just about me not being good enough for them. It was about them wanting a pawn who could help them keep up appearances and pay off a debt from decades ago. Sarah, Emily, Marianne, they were all just pieces in a twisted family chess game. I turned to Sarah, voice quivering with heartbreak. "Tell me this. Did you ever love me, or was I just some stand-in until your parents found the right guy?" Tears slid down her cheeks. "David, I do love you. I swear I do. I didn't know how to tell you about all of this." Mrs. Miller cut in, icy once again. "Sarah, that's enough. David is not part of our plan. He never was." Sarah looked from me to her parents, her lips trembling. And just like at dinner, the night I walked out, she fell silent. She couldn't stand up to them. Not now, maybe not ever. I felt my heart splinter, but something inside me, something that had been dormant, rose up. This was the exact moment I realized I deserved to be with someone whose family didn't trap her in a life sentence to repay a debt. Someone who wouldn't let her parents degrade the person she claimed to love. Without another word, I turned on my heel and walked out the front door, this time for good.